The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
Hi, my name is Harry Belafonte. I'm an artist, and I'm not a politician. I'm voting for this senator. How about you?
Vote for a leader like Roosevelt. Vote for John F. Kennedy for president.
In 1960, Senator John F. Kennedy's and Vice President Richard Nixon's campaigns made every effort to secure endorsements from celebrities and pop culture figures of the day.
It's not so dissimilar to how today's presidential candidates are cultivating the endorsement of social influencers and seeking to create viral moments during the campaign. In this episode, we'll look at how presidential campaigns, then and now, cultivated influencers and used the latest technologies to help push them over the finish line in November. Next on our special election 2024 edition of JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Jamie Richardson.
And I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to the latest season of JFK 35. This season is a special one for us where we'll look at the historic nature of the 2024 election.
And we will also look back at how today's campaigns connect to those from the 1960s. We hope you will enjoy this season as we speak with historians, journalists, and other experts to discuss presidential politics from the Kennedy era to today.
From Kamala Harris's brat summer to Hulk Hogan's viral shirt-ripping moment at the Republican National Convention, the 2024 presidential campaign has been fueled by widely shared internet videos and memes from celebrities and other influencers.
Candidates seeking to use pop culture to jumpstart their campaigns is nothing new. When we look back on the election between Senator John F. Kennedy and Vice President Richard Nixon, both campaigns were assembling their own groups of A-list movie stars, stage performers, and other notable figures to throw their support behind each campaign. Nixon campaign backers included dancer and performer Fred Astaire, tough guy actor James Cagney, acclaimed animator and movie producer Walt Disney, star of Western films John Wayne, and former child star Shirley Temple, among others. On the Kennedy side, you would find Rat Pack member Joey Bishop, band leader Cab Calloway, stars of the silver screen Judy Garland, Henry Fonda and Paul Newman, and famed pediatrician Dr. Benjamin Spock. JFK even had Frank Sinatra cut this musical campaign ad, a slight edit of Sinatra's biggest hit at the time.
High hopes, he's got high hopes. 1960's the year for his high hopes. Come on and vote for Kennedy, and we'll come out on top. Oops, there goes the opposition girl. Oops, there goes the opposition.
Just as candidates today receive public endorsements from celebrities like Taylor Swift to reach key demographics, President Kennedy received the endorsement of singer, actor, and civil rights activist Harry Belafonte. Belafonte sat down for an interview with Senator Kennedy that the campaign cut into a political ad for black voters. In 1960, many of those voters were deciding whether they should switch from their historic record of backing a Republican candidate to voting for a Democrat.
Hi, my name is Harry Belafonte. I'm an artist, and I'm not a politician. But like most Americans, I have a great interest in the political and the economic destiny of my country. I'm seated here with Senator Jack Kennedy. As a Negro and as an American, I have many questions, and I'm sure everyone does, about civil rights, about foreign policy, about the economy of the country, and about things that'll happen.
And I want to make it very clear, Harry, that on this question of equality of opportunity for all Americans, whether it's in the field of civil rights, better minimum wages, better housing, better working conditions, jobs, I stand for these things. The Democratic Party under Franklin Roosevelt stood for them.
I'm voting for this senator. How about you?
Vote for a leader like Roosevelt. Vote for John F. Kennedy for president.
Today, social media and the advancement of communication technologies have made it even easier for viral moments to happen. It's no longer just celebrities and pop culture figures that candidates are looking for support either. In this campaign, both candidates are relying on influencers, persons with thousands or even millions of followers online that can help spread their campaign's message.
I had the chance earlier this month to speak with Syracuse University's School of Information professor Jennifer Stromer-Galley. Hello, I'm joined by Jennifer Stromer-Galley, who has studied social media activity by presidential campaigns. She wrote the award-winning book, Presidential Campaigning in the Internet Age. Jennifer, thank you for joining me today.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Before we talk about what's going on today, we know over time presidential campaigns and candidates have used many different types of media to get their message out to voters. And I think it might be a good chance for us to talk about the past before we get to the future. For example, at the JFK Library, we know that President Kennedy was one of the first candidates to really utilize the new medium of television at that time, which had just begun spreading across American households, and TVs were just becoming ubiquitous in the 1960s. So starting with this question, what candidates come to mind from the past in the last 100 years that you think were good examples of candidates using new forms of mass media to their advantage?
A candidate that I think really capitalized on the new medium was Eisenhower. When he was running for president the first time around, TV was just moving into people's homes. They were black and white. And the idea of advertisements by candidates was still really novel. And so the ad producers at that time that worked with Eisenhower's campaign actually came from Disney. And they ran very cute TV advertisements that were animated shorts showing elephants and flags and people marching, singing, I like Ike, you like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. And, this kind of jingly, cute advertisements. And I think about those because they seem so sweet and kind compared to the sorts of advertising, that we see today. But it was really that kind of first experiment. And then another candidate that comes to mind is actually Howard Dean, who ran in 2004. And Dean was quite innovative because he established a blog on his website where his campaign staff would post regular narrative updates about what was happening on the Dean campaign as he was traveling around New Hampshire and Iowa during the primaries. And that blog drew thousands, hundreds of thousands of Democratic supporters who became increasingly enthusiastic about the Dean campaign. He kind of came out of nowhere at that time because prior to that, he was kind of a no-name governor. And so the blog allowed for ordinary people to get closer to the campaign, to get inside and see what was happening in the campaign, and they could comment on the post. So they would talk to each other, and it really exemplified the power of the internet to engage people in new ways with the campaign.
And I think about these the early Eisenhower commercials. I actually remember the I Like Ike commercial, or like Howard Dean, being the first to set up a blog. Just thinking about that, while they were the first, it almost feels like it took the next campaign to really drive that forward, right? You had the I Like Ike commercials, and then Kennedy sort of had the Mad Men sort of thing down by 1960. And you look at Howard Dean, and then you see, I guess he was the precursor to President Obama, right?
That's right.
So tell us a little bit about that, like how these two, inspired sort of the next generation just a campaign or two later.
Yeah, no, it's a great observation that a candidate will experiment with the medium to see what's possible. And then it gets further professionalized as well as, kind of defined with the subsequent election. So you mentioned Obama, for example, in 2008. He didn't use his campaign website did have a blog, but what Obama really leaned into was MySpace, which is, again, a precursor to
for everybody
Facebook.
Under the age of 25, that is the pre-Facebook Facebook.
That's exactly right. And so, he had an active MySpace account and, used it to engage supporters. Again, they had a blog as well on the website. And like the Dean campaign, they allowed the public to post comments on the blog and engage in discussion. And, it's always one of the tensions, though, for candidates when they're using these digital platforms because it can backfire. So, Obama ran into an issue with a policy position that some of his supporters were opposed to. And they took to the blog to criticize Obama on his own campaign blog about this policy position. And, the campaign had to decide, were they going to delete this stuff or leave it up or respond to it? And they did what a lot of campaigns did. They just kind of ignored it and pretended that it wasn't there. But, these new forms of communication, they have strategic advantage for candidates, but they also do open up challenges or tensions.
And we're going to get into a lot of those challenges and tensions in a few moments. But before we go there, another history question, just to wrap this up. We can think of the major moments in mass media developments, right? The introduction of radio, then television, and then now in this century, the internet has sort of been the big thing. What made each of these changes significant for political campaigns, particularly the national ones in like presidential races?
Yeah. So the power of radio and television was that it allowed the candidates to really make their case directly to the public in their living rooms in an intimate setting that didn't exist in the kind of print age of campaigning. And that ability for the campaign to speak to people through advertisements directly in people's homes opened up new kinds of persuasion. And, the challenge campaigns then started to have to navigate in the broadcast era is, how do you craft a message that will appeal to a broad public? Because if you're buying a television advertisement in a media market, you're not just buying your own party supporters, you're buying for the broader public because it's broadcast, it's touching everybody who turned on that television set at that time. And so candidates had to figure out how to appeal broadly to the public. And it changed the way that they message. And of course, with 30-second messaging, they also had to get more concise and clear in how they communicated. And of course, the visual matters a lot. So the use of symbolism, iconography, compelling imagery to further tell the story was part of the challenge and the opportunities, I think, for the televisual era. And then moving into the internet, what became noteworthy in the early days of campaigning online is that candidates discovered that they could bypass the journalism community to speak directly to supporters. So while campaigns in the televisual era could broadcast, they were still relying a lot on news media to help tell the story about their campaign, which meant that journalists were making choices about what they were going to report in their stories about the candidates. But once you move into the internet, the candidates realized that they didn't have to rely on journalists to help get their message out to the broader public. They could tailor a message on their website and through their email in those early days, and then eventually blogs, and then MySpace, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc., to really start to micro-target to pockets of voters that they most wanted to reach. And so today, one of the things that we research and are concerned about are these micro-targeting strategies that are not visible, right? So if a candidate runs a Facebook advertisement to you, I don't have access to that. I don't have a way to see it in the same way that I did in the televisual era with TV ads because they're broadcast. Micro-targeting messages are narrowcast to small pockets. And one of the concerns we have is that candidates then are saying tailored messages to those pockets that they're not saying to the broader public. And that can lead to concerns about misinformation and voter manipulation.
Yeah. And that leads perfectly into my next question, which, getting to the more recent history, 2016, the internet was playing a large role in the election, maybe in some cases in a really dark way. We saw the Russian bots and trolls sort of targeting, as I said, doing this kind of targeting, spreading misinformation. We also saw Donald Trump sort of bragging about the use of his social media advertising, that maybe, at least some claim, was ahead of the game compared to the Clinton campaign with the way they were targeting. It led Facebook to actually change their targeting rules, right? because of that. So what was your reflection sort of in 2016 of how that was playing out?
Yeah, so 16 is interesting because Trump really leaned into digital advertising. If my memory is right, he spent 4 times more than Clinton did in that election on social media advertising. And those micro targeting practices were being honed. Now, there's some controversy because one of the companies that Trump contracted with was Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica is noteworthy for getting in trouble by having taken data about Facebook users against the privacy and the news settings that Facebook had established for companies or organizations that were accessing Facebook's users. Cambridge basically took data, private data from ordinary people that were using Facebook to build predictive algorithms on personality and on kind of interests or preference. And then they sold that to the campaigns as a way of saying, hey, we can help you tailor your message to target audiences based on their personality or psychological characteristics. And it's kind of a holy grail for campaigns. They really love to be able to figure out how to write the message that will somehow convert voters. And so, yeah, so Trump, actively used Cambridge Analytica. In the end, actually, Cambridge was not that successful or effective, but it highlights how important these advertising practices are to campaigns, that they're willing to experiment with companies who are selling basically like snake oil to try to get to voters that the candidates want.
Yeah, and it was, because people could be targeted with that misinformation, as you said, people were getting ads that no one else saw. And I want to keep progressing forward. So 8 years later, you mentioned that when the internet came up, traditional media had to compete now with sort of other non-traditional media. And it seems like this campaign, we're seeing it at a much higher level. We're seeing, Donald Trump go on podcasts, independent podcasts, rather than interviews with the Washington Post or New York Times. And Kamala Harris and the DNC, they invited dozens of major influencers to cover the DNC for the first time alongside traditional media. So how would you describe the effect of these new influencers that sometimes have millions and millions of followers on the campaigns this time around?
So I see what's happening today as a continuation of a trend we've seen really since the 80s. So late night television shows and soft news shows started to dominate the broadcast and television airwaves in the 80s. And so, for example, Bill Clinton went on a show hosted by a guy named Arsenio Hall. And it was sort of a newsy, very soft news commentary and entertainment news show. And Clinton got criticized because he was avoiding speaking to traditional print and broadcast reporters in favor of going on to shows like Arsenio Hall. And as researchers, one of the things we note is that candidates don't like to talk to traditional news reporters because they ask hard questions. Whereas if candidates go and speak to either soft news entertainment shows, or as we're just talking about, podcasts and these kind of alternative sources, those hosts are not journalists. They don't ask the hard questions. They tend not to focus on policy and try to nail candidates down on where they would stand with, healthcare or taxes or tariffs. And so it's a way for the politician to get their message out there to voters, but in a friendly, supportive kind of context. So what's happening today, I actually don't see as that new. It's an extension of what we've been seeing from candidates for a really long time.
That's interesting. If you can answer this quickly, just to follow up on that, do you think, though, it's hurting traditional news media even more now than maybe it was in the 80s, like that it's happening more often?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. The hard part is that this isn't what's hurting traditional news media. What's hurting traditional news media is the business, is the economics of news and the changing dynamics that, again, the internet brought. So news media, especially print, relied on advertisements, and they no longer get that ad revenue, and people don't subscribe anymore to the print editions. And so they don't have a way to make money.
Yeah.
And so you see local news rooms all around the country closing down or greatly cutting back. And so more and more, it's the wire services like the Associated Press and Reuters that become the main outlet for people to get their news about political candidates and politics. And so it does create a gap that I think influencers
Are
on
feeling.
podcasts and YouTube and social media platforms then can fill, because it's an inexpensive form, and those influencers have really large audiences, which again are beneficial for candidates to speak to.
Right. And just continuing on about sort of these influencers and non-traditional media, we're seeing what some are describing the meme campaigns this year. You know, we saw when Kamala Harris launched her campaign, there was this post by the pop star Charlie XCX referring to Harris as Brat, which is a reference to her Charlie's popular album. The campaign changed their social media. It was this way to reach these younger voters. And then in a darker way, just recently, you know, the Trump campaign and other Republicans, including his vice presidential candidate, have been sharing memes sort of alleging that Haitian immigrants are taking people's pets and eating them in Springfield, Ohio. What do these examples, both positive and negative, about sort of the meme campaign that you've observed seeing it in action this year?
Memes are entertaining to watch. They also encapsulate the cultural zeitgeist that the campaign is in. So memes to me are really interesting because what catches on and becomes a meme. So by definition, well, actually, it's actually hard to define a meme, but a meme is something that is trading on some aspect of current culture that resonates. So it's a little encapsulated moment that helps, I don't know, kind of sum up what's happening in the current context. Mm-hmm. And so, but that in of itself doesn't make a meme. It needs to go viral, right? It needs to have a broader reach. And so there is this kind of interesting resonance, if you will, that's happening between the content and the audience that then allows it to spread and go viral. And so, you know, you see campaigns really want content to go viral, but they can't manufacture that. It has to somehow, again, sort of speak to the moment, and that's hard to manufacture. Influencers help. So when a campaign is capitalizing on a moment to try to underscore an event or an issue or a character aspect of their personality or their positions, you know, they'll encapsulate that in a video or an image and then try to see if that will get out there. But influencers can help boost that. Although even influencers, if it doesn't quite resonate, it's still not going to go anywhere. And so there is a synergy, if you will, it's happening between the campaigns, the cultural moment, and influencers that allow these memes to really spread. Campaigns love memes because they reach a broader public that is often otherwise not paying that much attention to politics. And so for brand recognition, memes are really beneficial for campaigns.
And I guess if it's positive, that's great for brands. But what about the dangers of when a candidate, like an actual candidate for office, is sharing memes or these type of viral posts that have, again, what's going on in Springfield, Ohio, that's resulted in their lockdowns and everything? Like, the danger of these memes, because they're not vetted, right? They aren't journalistic posts, can have a major impact.
100%, right? There's no requirement that memes are true. And they can have very real consequences for the people who are the object of the meme. And, you know, I guess from my perspective, I do long for the days when candidates were held accountable by journalists and the public for their words and for their actions. But we don't have that sort of mechanism at this moment in time to really hold politicians to account. Platforms are not monitoring, regulating, removing, or reducing the spread of factually incorrect information. They say that's not their purpose. That's not what they're required to do. They're just common carriers functionally. They're like telephones. They don't regulate the content. They just help channel the content unless it's violating child pornography laws, those kinds of things. But otherwise, if it comes to politics, it's free speech. But we I think the current public sphere and our current political moment is really challenged by the false and misleading information that is being spread through memes and through just the messages that politicians and other political actors, including influencers, are spreading. Real people get hurt in these efforts to say anything to get elected. And I think as we move past this election into the next one, as a nation, we really need to reflect on what we want as a society and if this is actually in our benefit as a collective to have no holds barred speech for the sake of speech, regardless of who it hurts or whether it's true.
We've talked about the memes and the issues they present. There's one other part of the internet that's sort of progressing really fast, and that's artificial intelligence, or AI as it's referred to. For example, we saw Taylor Swift, who had kind of wanting to seemingly stay out of this campaign a bit, voice her support for Kamala Harris after the debate. And that was partly due to the fact that the Trump campaign had been sharing or liking posts that had used AI to make it appear as Swift may be supporting former President Trump. So, again, this is like really, really new technology, but how do you think AI is also changing campaigns this year?
I had imagined that there would be some significant event before the election that would be some sort of AI generated message that journalists or the public fell for and reported as true. So far, that hasn't quite happened. I mean, I think the Taylor Swift example is, again, it's about a celebrity. There's been a lot of issues for celebrities and AI generated deep fakes in really problematic situations. But we haven't yet seen political candidates, say Trump or Harris themselves, being deep faked and something then generated that looks as if they said something that they didn't actually say. That's not to say it won't still happen, but I'm hopeful at this late juncture that we're not going to see something like that happen. But the fact that we have to worry about it says that we are in a moment that there isn't sufficient regulation. There are not sufficient penalties for actors who might try to manipulate the public through artificial intelligence. I will say a lot of the deep fakes, if you look at them closely, many of them you can detect or get a sense that there's something not right. But as the technology gets better and better, those deep fakes are going to be even harder to identify as deep fakes. And unfortunately, there is not good technology out there that can help you accurately identify when something has been an AI generated deep fake. And so, yeah, the Congress, given how divided it is unable to properly legislate some of these current pressing issues. And I really do worry, even coming into the next midterms in 2026, what sorts of potential manipulation we're going to see if the government doesn't establish better regulations.
Yeah. And so my last question to set this up, in 2016, we just talked about Cambridge Analytica, Russian trolls, and we kind of did see in 2020 and 2024, there's been a bit of a reset, right? That people are a little more savvy about Russian hackers, and the Facebook, at least, has done some fixing of its data so that a company like Cambridge Analytica can't do the same kind of targeting in the way that it did in 2016. So my question is, we're learning a lot about memes and the destructive possibilities that they can create, or, sort of these influencers that can cause problems, or AI. What do you think are potential solutions or ways that, again, you were talked about this briefly, but let's go into a little more detail. How can 2028 handle these new technologies better than as they're emerging now in 2024?
It's a great question. So the current ad environment online is functionally unregulated. And while there are regulations around advertisements on television and broadcast and print, we lack good policy and regulation around advertising and messaging on social media. And it's a bit of a quagmire because the current regulatory environment for social media basically says that social media, because it's running through the internet, is functionally a common carrier. As a result, they're not required to filter or manage the content unless it violates laws that are on the books around, again, say, child pornography. And so, I think Congress needs to spend some time really reflecting on the health of our democracy and what regulations and disclaimers need to be required of political actors if they're going to engage in especially paid messaging on political messages on social media platforms. The other sorts of unpaid messaging, so people just sharing their opinions on social media, again, it's really, really hard to regulate that, but at least starting with the paid ads, which we know are intentionally, strategically trying to change attitudes and persuade people, those I think we need to really look at and establish some clear regulations.
And outside of those regulations, maybe also, you mentioned that part of the problem is people can share these false stories without sort of being challenged. And perhaps we need more society or other politicians to really challenge them to not share these types of false messaging.
Right. So the norms in our current society don't punish politicians who are engaging in intentionally misleading messaging. So again, looking at what's happening in Ohio, ideally, from my perspective, there should be a unified message coming from every corner of the political sphere that says that is inappropriate. You cannot, should not be attacking legal residents with racist messages for the purpose of misleading voters and trying to win elections. But we don't currently have that, right? We don't have a unanimous set of voices across the internet around the kind of political sphere saying, no, that's unacceptable. And it's only when politicians begin to lose elections, lose supporters, and kind of lose their stature with their peers, when they engage in these kinds of messages, will we see it stop? And that requires norms, and we don't currently have that normative environment.
Well, it has been a historic election, and we don't know where the technology is going to go, but thank you so much for giving us some insight on the past and what's going on today.
Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share some of this. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to today's episode in our special season looking at the historic nature of the 2024 election. We will have a new episode each Thursday until Election Day. If you're interested in learning more about some of the topics we discussed today, you can visit our podcast page at jfklibrary.org/jfk35 to find out more.
If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or find us across social media at jfklibraryfdn using the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening and have a great week.